Well, I was particularly struck by the different ways in which 1989 is understood in different parts of the world. So in Western Europe and North America, I suppose the dominant discourse is one of the victory over communism. And though we've discussed at this conference the sort of lack of historical knowledge or interest that sometimes can come from Western Europe or elsewhere, nevertheless there are a set of underlying assumptions about that event. Firstly, that it's a victory over communism, and also to give you one particular example, after 9/11, George W. Bush decides he wants to set up a World Freedom Day. This should be on November the 9th, the same day as the fall of the Berlin Wall, and this tries to construct a story which links various fights for freedom that of, let's say, World War I, World War II, the struggle against communism in the Cold War, and attempts to link it then to the war on terror. So 1989 becomes one victory amongst many in the cause for freedom. This is a very particular neoconservative take, but actually I think it reflects a more broadly held set of assumptions about the end of communism in Eastern Europe. But when I was writing the book, I was very much struck by the diversity of opinion about 1989 in Eastern Europe, and the number of different opinions, including at that point a very dominant one, the idea of an unfinished revolution, which particularly came from conservative parties. We might think of Viktor Orban's Fidesz, or at that point Law and Justice in Poland. And for them, 1989 was not a proper revolution. It didn't get rid of an older elite. There was no storming of the Bastille, as Jarosław Kaczynski put it. And this had led to a whole set of very problematic consequences which lasted through to the present. So for some of these people, a new revolution was necessary. I mean, of course, the process of an exit from communism was a very complex one that played out in different ways in different countries. In some, of course, it was primarily an elite negotiated exit from communism, which preserved an older elite in power, which of course we've seen all sorts of consequences of in the last years, particularly in the age of austerity. We've seen an awful lot of protest against the kind of corrupt, clientelistic structures that survived from 1989 across the Balkans, particularly prominent in Bulgaria last year in 2013. So I think the whole idea of 1989 for a lot of people is a kind of a missed moment. An opportunity to reform systems which wasn't taken. Some people go further than that and say it was a kind of betrayed revolution. You find this particularly, say, on the right in Poland, where they'll see 1989 as a kind of compact between the communists and the liberals to exclude a whole set of conservative values from the new system. So somehow 1989 it's not a fairy tale ending for many people, except perhaps the ex-communists. I mean, it's been interesting how various former communist figures have actually wanted to portray their role in 1989, to show themselves as, the liberators from communism. We were involved too. We did this. This, of course, further inflames people on other sides of the political spectrum who don't want former communists to be able to use this type of story for their own benefit. Generally, in Western Europe, there's either disinterest or a kind of background assumption of a victory over communism. I think actually it's interesting in the way in which it gives Central and Eastern European actors a different space in which to articulate a different idea about 1989. So, for example, you find, let's take Poland again, where it's quite difficult to find a consensual way to think about 1989 at home. So, for example, in 2009, there were various, I think, 3 different attempts in Warsaw more from parties in Warsaw to commemorate 1989. People couldn't agree quite how to do it, and it reflected the very divided ways in which people had seen that moment. But when it comes to the European level and acting, with Western Europe together to commemorate that important moment, it's much easier to contribute. So, Poland played a large role in the commemorations in Berlin. writing Solidarity's story alongside the Berlin Wall. And when the story is actually about, is a broader European story that links a national experience with one of Europe coming together, European unity, and so on, then I think that's a context which people are much happier to present that story. And then interestingly too, I mean, from about the same period, from 2008, Poland again was actually Polish elites, and also the Institute of National Remembrance too was interested in taking the stories of 1989 beyond Europe. So to North Africa during the period of the so-called Arab Rebellion, and also to other places in the world, for example, to South Korea, who were very interested in ideas of reunification and in ideas of eventually overcoming communism. So there's interesting ways in which 1989 can be talked about on the European level or globally, but still can be a very problematic and politically divisive memory domestically. Memory, of course, is always in flux. It's always divided, is always shaped by a whole variety of different local, national, regional, and global contexts. So you will never find specifically a common supranational European memory. I mean, what seems to have emerged is a set of common European norms, if you want, surrounding particularly the commemoration of victims of so-called totalitarian regimes. So the interest in commemorating Holocaust victims within European structures which emerged from the 1990s, I mean, very much as a way for the European Union to find a new kind of cultural historical identity after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, then actually provided a whole set of ways in which Central and Eastern Europeans could find a way of talking about their own experiences of victimization under dictatorship too. This is not to say, of course, it's a very harmonious relationship either. I mean, there are all sorts of problems of competitive victimization between both sides. Can you put these stories together? Is one story more important than the other? Does it really lead to commonality? So, I mean, despite there being, as it were, a common template, I don't think there's necessarily a common memory emerging. We're starting up a Leverhulme Trust-funded project called 1989 After 1989, Rethinking the Fall of State Socialism in Global Perspective. This is trying to think about, well, it's firstly a historical project that tries to think about the decline of state socialism within broader global phenomena. For example, the rise of neoliberalism, globalization, decolonization, and so on. But we're also interested, as I've been talking about here, in the processes of memory and the ways in which ideas about the collapse of state socialism circulate globally, regionally, locally, and how these types of memories interact.